second reading comes from the Gospel of John, the 6th chapter, verses 1 through 15. Actually, in the lectionary, it was suggested we read 1 through 21, but I'm going to end at 15 for today. This is the story of the feeding of the 5,000. Jesus and the disciples have been out preaching and bearing the word, and they have just found out that John the Baptist has met an unfortunate death. They've been busy around the Sea of Galilee, healing and preaching, and a large crowd grows even larger, and the day is wearing on, and the people are hungry. Jesus could have sent the crowds away, but instead he feeds them with a little help from an unlikely source. Hear this reading from John's Gospel. After this, Jesus went to the other side of the Sea of Galilee, also called the Sea of Tiberias. A large crowd kept following him because they saw the signs that he was doing with the sick. Jesus went up the mountain and sat down there with his disciples. Now the Passover, the festival of the Jews, was near. When he looked up and saw a large crowd coming toward him, Jesus said to Philip, "Where are we going to buy bread for all these people to eat?" He said this to test him, for he himself knew what he was going to do. Philip answered him, 6 months' wages would not buy enough bread for each of them to get a little. One of his disciples, Andrew, Simon Peter's brother, said to him, "There's a boy here who has 5 loaves of barley bread and 2 fish, but what are they among so many people?" Jesus said, "Make the people sit down." And now there was a great deal of grass in the place, so they all sat down, all 5,000 of them. Then Jesus took the loaves, and when he had given thanks, he distributed them to those who were seated. So also the fish, so much as they wanted. When they were satisfied, he told the disciples, "Gather up the fragments left over so that nothing may be lost." So they gathered them up, and from the fragments of the 5 barley loaves left by those who had eaten, they filled 12 baskets. When the people saw the sign that he had done, they began to say, "This indeed is the prophet who is to come into the world." When Jesus realized that they were about to come and take him by force to make him king, he withdrew again to the mountain by himself. This is the word of the Lord. I have to tell you, sometimes the readings from the lectionary make magic as they rub up against each other and highlight one another's theological insights. But sometimes, like today, I just sit scratching my head and wonder in frustration, what in the world does the story of David's bad behavior and his murderous intentions have to do with the story of the feeding of the 5,000 from John's Gospel? Well, I just couldn't figure it out, so I turned to one of my theological sources and read that this one suggested that perhaps it's used as a contrast, to contrast the compassion of Jesus' behavior, that is, the son of David, over and against the backdrop of the lack of compassion of King David himself. Who knows? I don't know, but it sounded like a good enough reason to choose them to put them together. But for this morning's purposes, I'm just simply going to stick to the story of the feeding of the 5,000 and leave the story of David's bad behavior for another time. This story of feeding of the 5,000 on the shore of the Sea of Galilee is the only story that is found in all 4 of the Gospels, which most scholars would agree that this makes it one, if not the most important story of the Gospels. We are cautioned, though, not to read this story symbolically or through the lens of psychology. The reason being is that if we might possibly miss the real physical needs of the people that day. The reality that Jesus knew that the people that had come to see and hear him had Modern interpretations of this story are abundant. Some say that the meal was really a symbolic meal and that each person just took a teeny tiny bit of each element and passed it on to the next person. But then that doesn't explain the 12 baskets that were left over. Another interpretation explains, well, people must have come to hear Jesus knowing that they would be there a while, and they carried a little bit of food with them. And when they saw that the little boy came forward to share his meal, then they began to also share their meal with others, and that's why there's 12 baskets left over. Then there's, of course, the other interpretation, which is a more literal reading, that Jesus actually performed a miracle and made the food, reproduce. You might remember, though, that the Bible is a place where a number of stories of miraculous feedings have occurred. There was the story of the prophet Elisha, who fed over 100 soldiers with a couple of ears of corn and loaves of bread, 20 loaves of bread. Remember, God sent the raven to feed the prophet Elijah with meat and bread. And God also sent manna to rain down on the exiles of the Israelites while they were in exile. So the story of the feeding of the 5,000 is not really a biblical novelty. And if it's not a new thing that Jesus is doing here, then why is it so important that it ends up in all four Gospels? Why would they bother to write it down again? One of the reoccurring themes in the Gospel of John, says a writer in One Christian Century magazine, is of God's abundance. In the first chapter, John speaks about Jesus as the Word from whose fullness we have all received grace upon grace. Consider the first time when water is turned into wine at the wedding in Cana. The result is profusion, not merely of wine, but of good wine. Then at the community well, Jesus tells the woman from Samaria about the living waters gushing up to eternal life. And then in another chapter, the writer of John's Gospel talks about God's house, where there are many mansions. But the people gathered that day on the shore of the Sea of Galilee had not read John's Gospel. They had no idea what God's abundance meant for them. Imagine yourself being on the shore that day, just trying to get a glimpse of this man who people were beginning to call the Messiah. Or better yet, imagine yourselves as one of the disciples. When Jesus asked, how are we going to provide bread for all of these people? You probably too would respond just like Philip did. Are you out of your mind, Jesus? And you see all these people? There's no way in God's green earth that we're going to be able to feed them. But a boy whose mother had packed a good lunch sees Jesus and asking for food, and so he does what any good boy would do. He would offer up his lunch. His lunch, which was simply a few small barley loaves and a couple of little dried fish. He carries it forward as if it's a precious gift and gives it to Andrew, who looks in the bag and tells Jesus that the boy has 5 barley loaves and 2 fish, but that would be totally inadequate to feed this many people. At this point, when Jesus sees that disciples have determined that the situation is impossible, that their abilities are inadequate to remedy the situation, he shows them that what they think is impossible is very much possible.